The golden art by many so esteemed, we have both proved, and by examples taught, that it no fable was, as many deemed, but real. Now our muse at length is brought, in order its due practice to unfold, by which attained may be silver and gold. Before modern medicine, before chemistry, another scientific practice existed that asked the radical question: does Paracelsus is gay? No, sorry. It asked, can man create gold out of other elements? Surely if metals are created within the earth, we can figure out a way to develop them artificially, right? Well, this study, called alchemy, was a very popular and equally maligned practice in the Middle Ages. As much as it was argued about, it was just as supported, and a lot of that came down to curiosity and the promise of almost infinite wealth. But today, we mostly know alchemy as a secretive and unusual esoteric practice in the same vein as witchcraft. Because today, we know what medieval scientists didn't, that you can't create real gold, not truly. So of course alchemy looks rather silly, arcane even. This perspective only arrived following the advent of modern chemistry though, when the need for alchemy had passed on. Of course, with modern eyes, alchemy looks an awful lot like mysticism and sorcery. Pair that with decades of pop culture representations of alchemists as occult sages, and you've got an image of alchemy that doesn't have much in common with what it truly was. So what was medieval alchemy actually like anyway? Come learn with me. Sidebar, this month's channel charity is Feeding America, which is providing vital supplies, food, and other support to victimized areas of the US after Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. So many of the most impacted people in Florida and Appalachia right now have nothing left and no money or resources to recover, so on-the-ground support is vital. I've made a donation, and I highly recommend that you do the same if you have anything to give. The link and more info is down below in the description. And now let's get into it, but first, a word from today's sponsor, Birch Living. The weather is finally cooling down, which means it's almost time to put away the 4 fans that I have strategically placed in my bedroom to create a wind tunnel cool enough to sleep. But at the very least, my mattress has been helping a lot with my sleep issues in general. I've been sleeping on the Birch Luxe mattress for several months now, and I cannot even begin to tell you what a big difference it has made in my sleep. Birch makes mattresses crafted with responsibly sourced materials like 100% natural latex and organic cotton and wool. Not only that, but their mattresses have absolutely no polyurethane foam, which creates nasty off-gassing and is made with fiberglass. Did you know that a lot of foam mattresses are full of fiberglass? Birch doesn't have those issues though, so you can sleep easy knowing that you aren't sleeping on a literal pile of fiberglass and chemicals. They don't even have fiberglass in their manufacturing facility, which rocks. So when I was looking into new mattresses, I knew that I wanted one that doesn't create harmful off-gassing and is made with natural, safe materials. Not just for me, but for my cat daughter who sleeps on my bed too, and she's been loving it. And she loves the pillows too. Birch mattresses are all GOTS and GreenGuard Gold certified, so you know it's not all talk. This baby is naturally allergen, mildew, and flame resistant because it uses natural wool. It gets shipped right to your door for free in the US, and it was also very easy to set up, especially if you follow the instructions correctly, which I didn't do. And if you aren't sure that you can do it, they do offer in-home setup and unwrapping, which is really nice because it's definitely heavy. The Birch Luxe mattress is a nice upgrade from the original and comes with 2 free comfy eco-rest pillows, and after sleeping on it for a few months now, I can confirm that I am sleeping more soundly and definitely in less pain. I love my Birch mattress, and I think you would too. If you're looking for a new bed, check out Birch Living to upgrade your sleep with 20% off a Birch mattress plus 2 free eco-rest pillows. Visit birchliving.com/Kaz to find out more about this limited time offer. You also get a 100-night sleep trial and 25-year warranty. Thank you so much to Birch for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about medieval alchemy. I think a really good place to start is getting the very basics out of the way, and this is explained super well by the authors of What Was Alchemy in Acta Physica Polonica A, volume 112. That's a mouthful. In order to understand alchemy, we must free ourselves from a number of legends. Alchemy was not proto-chemistry. It was not an occult science persecuted by church or state authorities. Neither was it the inheritance of the secret wisdom of pharaonic Egypt due to Hermes Trismegistes, 3 times very great, a fusion of the Egyptian god Thought and the Greek Hermes, considered by some other authors as a sage who lived in Egypt either in the 19th or the 13th century BC. Alchemy belongs to a restricted class of sciences which were not invented by the Greeks during the classical period. The modern chemist tries, as far as possible, to isolate the system under study from the remaining parts of the world. Such a criterion cannot be satisfied by the alchemist, who believes in the infinite chain of interrelations between all material and spiritual beings in the world, so that it is impossible to isolate any fraction of it from the others. Once again, apologize for the crying cat outside my door, but if she comes in here, it'll be so much worse and she'll probably knock this curtain down. I love her so much. So we know pretty specifically what alchemy is or isn't, but pinpointing exactly where it came from is a much more difficult task due to the usual suspects. Uh-oh, it's that problem we keep running into, a lack of reliable or surviving historical documentation, which makes it really, really hard to get a good grasp on just how alchemy actually began. Like, yeah, we have a good idea, but the details are murky. And it doesn't help that a lot of the details have been filtered down through the ages in a game of historical telephone. But thankfully, alchemy has a ton of research behind it because it's a cool topic. So here's what we know. It's thought that alchemical practice began around the 300th BC in Egypt after the conquest of Alexander the Great. Unsurprisingly, a lot of these early dabblings were in Alexandria, which, as I talked about in my video on the Library of Alexandria, was a huge cultural and academic center of the ancient world due to its location and, yes, its library. It's hard to say specifics on these early experiments, but sometime in the 300s AD, people started taking it to the next, more recognizable level. What if we could make gold out of other metals? This time period brought us the Physica Kai Mystica, which is the earliest known alchemical text. The Physica discusses the creation of gold using fire, where the 4 stages occur through a changing of color under high heat. Now, the idea of being able to create gold is obviously very attractive. It's the most precious, valuable metal, after all. In Greek, this process was called chrysopoeia, and the silver version was called argyropoeia. While the idea of being able to create gold or silver out of stuff that isn't gold or silver sounds very silly, it honestly made a lot of sense in pre-chemistry worlds, because you could verifiably extract pure gold or silver out of other mixed metals or minerals where it was floating around in there. So the train of thought kind of made sense in that context. A big character that pops up a lot in alchemical history is this most certainly fictional dude named Hermes Trismegistus, who basically is like a god king and philosopher who was an expert in the occult and alchemy. If you've ever heard the term hermetic or hermeticism before, this is the guy that comes from. Anyways, Hermes wrote this book called the Tabula Smaragdina, which regales the story of how he discovered the Philosopher's Stone, which is created through the combined power of the male sun and the female moon chemicals. Now, a lot of you have probably heard about the Philosopher's Stone in a pop culture context. But what actually is it? So the Philosopher's Stone, as it's understood by later alchemists in the Middle Ages, was both considered a real thing and a symbolic concept. Symbolically, it represents the transformation of early man into illuminated philosopher. And so it's like this material representation of enlightenment and unity. Beyond that, it's actually really confusing what it actually is, even to the ancients. Some writings even insinuate that the stone is not physical, but rather something that exists in man's subconscious, and could be accessed via meditation and study. And according to writers like Carl Jung, who is one of the biggest voices in alchemical history, the Philosopher's Stone can only be understood not as an actual stone. I think this is an amethyst. I don't know. I've had it since I was a kid. I don't even know where it came from. Maybe this is the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone can only be understood as not an actual stone, but as a metaphor for the self. Anyway, put a pin in the whole Philosopher's Stone thing. We will be getting back to it later. But yeah, the key thing to note here is that Hermes was a big figure in alchemical history, and he also coined the phrase, "as above, so below." So yeah, he was truthfully likely not a real guy, and we actually have absolutely no idea who wrote these things if that's the case, but holy shit, what a huge cultural contribution. Another central figure was Zosimos of Pelopolis, who hung out in Alexandria and basically wrote alchemical treatises all day long. He's the one that many scholars believe is responsible for creating the idea that alchemy is supposed to be this big, secret, spooky practice with like symbols and codes and whatnot. Hermes and Zosimos, as the two most commonly known central early figures defining alchemy, became the icons and reference points for later alchemists. But there's a third figure that I think I would be remiss not to point out, which is a sort of obscure alchemist who is referred to a lot of the time as Mary the Jewess, who probably was the author of On Furnaces and Apparatuses. Mary was something of an inventor and a tinkerer, and she invented a great deal of goofy-looking contraptions that she used in her alchemy, like double boilers and metal stands and glass distillers, which would go on to become the visual standard for any respectable alchemical lab in popular culture. But although in our minds today alchemy is the realm of wizened English sorcerers, a huge swath of the alchemical legacy came through the ancient Arabic world, starting around the 640s when Alexandria was invaded. The Greeks, who had sort of started the whole deal in the first place, shared their ideas with Muslim scientists who went on and elaborated on those ideas. In fact, most actually practiced alchemy from that point through the Middle Ages took place in the Arab world, because that's where the most intense and dedicated scientific mathematical advancement was happening. This is in part because the ideas described in the Quran support alchemical theory, theologically speaking, and those ideas related in huge ways to the ancient Greek philosophies, so really all of these trains of thought were circularly connected. One of the most prominent Persian alchemists was Abu Musa Jabir ibn Hayyan, who continued the Hermetic trend of writing about alchemy in a spooky, secretive way that reinforced the idea of its esoteric nature. Jabir also created one of the central theories of alchemy, which is that gold is made from equal parts mercury and sulfur. And I need to clarify, kinda, that the mercury and sulfur that he was describing were not the modern elements mercury and sulfur, but rather like vibes. It's hard to explain, but it was the same sort of stuff, but also not really the exact thing that you'd see on the periodic table. Anyway, this whole theory was super persistent because the method for practicing it actually produced chemical reactions, so it's like, yay, something is happening that we can see with our eyeballs. Modern chemistry wasn't a thing yet, so this was as close as people got. And of course, any scientific discovery is really cool and interesting, and alchemy on its own wasn't all that offensive, even to the super religious. Most of the time. It was the philosophical and theological angles that were inextricably paired with it that got people fighting, along with accusations of fraud. Today we view science as a unique field separate from religion, but historically that has not been the case. Religion was steeped in every aspect of people's lives, so it makes sense that it was attached to scientific practice too. So there was always going to be some factor or phase of alchemy that upset people. But the science driving it is what made it stick. People will argue and be suspicious, sure, but you can't stop them from being curious. The alchemical tradition continued through the Middle Ages after a few centuries of being shut out on account of being too witchy for the clergy, which some of you might find it weird that it came back at all. What? This weird occult science that was popular in an era when the church had so much intense power? Well, yeah, for a number of reasons. One being that alchemy was not seen as a cult in the Middle Ages. In fact, a lot of popes defended it. Really, it was just a valid form of science. And the church, contrary to popular belief, actually did fund most scientific research in the Middle Ages. And alchemy especially has the enticing promise of a return on investment. A science that creates one of the most valuable metals in the world Sign us up! Around the 12th century, a number of European travelers returned from the Arabic world with alchemical and Aristotelian writings, and these writings were promptly translated. Many scholars were very eager to have alchemy legitimized as a valid science. So the medieval alchemists took some practices from ancient times and elaborated on them using the planets and astral bodies paired up with metals. So gold was the sun, silver was the moon, quicksilver was Mercury, copper was Venus, lead was Saturn, tin was Jupiter, and iron was Mars. And then you've obviously got mercury, sulfur, and salt, the three principles, and later on came incorporation of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. By the 13th century, they began incorporating Augustinian theories that claimed that God created all living things, but that most things remain seeds in that they exist to become something else. So this sort of answers the reasoning behind alchemy. If some earthly things and materials exist as seeds to become other things, we can harness and control and expand on those processes. The seed thing is sort of a constant in medieval alchemy, and the other big theme was that there are four main colors that represent the stages of alchemical process: black, white, yellow, and red. So them's the basics. Thing is, as long as alchemy was popularly practiced, it also did have its detractors. Persian scientist Avicenna, who hilariously is noted in historical texts as a pro-alchemist, once wrote, "As to the claims of the alchemists, it must be clearly understood that it is not in their power to bring about any true change of species. They can, however, produce excellent imitations. Yet in these dyed metals, the essential nature remains unchanged. They are merely so dominated by induced qualities that errors may be made concerning them." So in short, he believes that yes, alchemists can definitely change the color of stuff. Anyway, the High Middle Ages is when things started getting really silly. Back to the seed thing, they thought that alchemical gold created seeds, and that if you purify these seeds, you can multiply them, and thus make gold out of these seeds. Like a gold farm, like a plant! As alchemist Petrus Bonus wrote, "As the egg of the hen without the seed of the male bird can never become a chicken, so common quicksilver without sulfur can never become gold." Well, the sillier things got, the more criticism that alchemy drew. Especially from Pope John the 22nd, who was like the world's biggest alchemy anti. Not because he thought it was heresy, but because he just kind of thought it was stupid. Unfortunately, the English also fucking hated Pope John the 22nd, so they fully ignored him and kept on with the gold seed stuff. In fact, it seems that alchemy continued a persistent growth in popularity from the 15th to the 16th century. The 16th century especially has an extraordinary amount of alchemical treatises that got published. Obviously, the kings of the era were pretty interested in the concept of multiplying wealth, but as per usual, the Franciscans had a lot to say on the subject. Most notable was the Franciscan friar, Roger Bacon, who penned many alchemical treatises, or at least a lot of them are ascribed to him. While researching this video, I took a little jaunt down to the Newberry Library to look at one of Bacon's works, which is this French-translated anthology published in the 1500s. It's really quite interesting because along with Bacon's famous work, The Mirror of Alchemy, it contains works of other alchemists, and even, apparently, Pope John the 22nd, the dude who hated alchemy, writing an alchemy guide? See, I could have just gotten this wrong and confused myself, which is likely. I don't know, his name is on it as saying by Pope John the 22nd. What do you want me to think? Please sound off below if you have the answer to this. A lot of this is sort of like alchemical guides and tutorials, and I'm sure none of them actually did very much, but I find it very charming nonetheless. So Roger Bacon was most interested in connecting alchemy to Christianity, and posited that the alchemical elixir of life is not all that different from the idea of resurrection, which is cool, but then Bacon is like, okay, no more being normal, let's use alchemy to battle the Antichrist. Now, in context, this actually makes a lot of sense because alchemy had so recently re-entered the Western European world, and so as a result, in the 13th and 14th century, we saw a lot of alchemists and alchemy fans doing their darndest to defend it, claiming that it actually supports Christian ideals and goals. A lot of people also believe that the Antichrist was on his way, and his ETA was like, imminent. So if we can weaponize alchemy to either battle the Antichrist or something, hey, why not? One alchemist named John of Rupecissa was particularly interested in the Aristotelian fifth element called quintessence, which was sort of like a cure-all, a substance of heaven that held holy powers. So John of Rupecissa was super interested in using alchemy to produce quintessence. Other alchemists firmly believed that alchemy was a product of the divine, rather than the natural world, in that it changes nature, like the virgin birth of Jesus. These theories about alchemy and the divine sometimes influenced medieval gender theory too. Like, for instance, the fact that some alchemists used theorizing about the Philosopher's Stone to argue that Jesus was either intersex or something like being non-binary because he was the combination of all contraries in one body. Obviously, because everyone and their uncle was doing their own alchemical theorizing, no one could really agree on a whole lot, especially the clergy outside looking in. Like, to non-alchemist churchmen, it sure does look a lot like alchemy should be considered witchcraft. The Franciscans did end up condemning it at some point, but even the mega-hater Pope John XXII excluded it from his list of condemned sorcery, which I find it very funny that he made a list and then just didn't keep it conveniently vague, because most of them would have done that. Other churchmen straight up believed that alchemists were dishonest, scammy rascals, and so because of that, if anyone ever actually succeeded with alchemy, then it was probably the fruits of a demonic pact. But despite the complicated nature of all of this, at the end of the day, almost all of these medieval alchemists were scientists by very valid medieval frameworks. Alchemy, like many other defunct practices of history, was a form of pre-chemistry scientific study, and these dudes didn't actually believe what they were doing was nefarious or esoteric, even if some of them maybe were scamming charlatans. Zachary Matus writes in Alchemy and Christianity, in nearly every example of religious expression in alchemy, even the most soteriological claims, the emphasis of the alchemist remained on the manipulation and observation of physical substances and processes. The religiosity of alchemy proceeded because of, not in spite of, its fundamental materiality. Some have been guilty of insisting on the religious nature of alchemy as irrational or inexpressible, which is to misunderstand it in an egregious way. Much of the religious expression emerged from rational minds meditating on a world they believed to have been purposely created for the expression of God's will. It is important to preserve the messiness and diversity of alchemical speculation and practice. Religious influence aside, there were plenty of non-religious alchemical writings, but overall the largest theme seemed to be the idea of alchemy as a way to perfect and improve man's soul. And many of these writers, in particular the 12th century translator Robert of Chester, who can be credited as one of the most vital players in bringing knowledge of alchemy back to Europe from the Arabic world, went to great lengths to posit alchemy as a long, ancient practice, attempting to argue for its validity. And due to its ancientness, they claimed that the ancient secrets of alchemy were once known, but now they're lost, and as alchemists they are simply recovering that divine truth. But this resulted in the weird tradition of secrecy that I mentioned earlier, which only made alchemy look more spooky and confusing to outsiders. Alchemists developed obscure language and symbols in an attempt to preserve the sanctity of the art, because the original knowledge of alchemy was thought to have been given to man by God, and therefore only the most worthy of men should learn it. It's no wonder why, given all the secrecy, alchemy eventually became permanently viewed as part of the realm of sorcery rather than a science. But let's revisit the Philosopher's Stone for a minute, because it has a lot to do with history's most famous alchemist, Nicholas Flamel. Now, anyone who read or watched Harry Potter has a good idea of what the legend is with this guy. Yes, he was indeed a real person. In fact, his house still stands in Paris. You can go visit it. And his actual tombstone is in the Cluny. But unfortunately, everything you think you know about Nicholas Flamel from pop culture is completely false. And guess who we have to blame again? The Victorians! Okay, not totally just the Victorians, but they definitely blew the myth up even if they didn't start it. Anyway, so according to the Book of Hieroglyphic Figures, which was published in 1624 and attributed to Flamel, the story goes that he bought an old book for super cheap in like 1357 or so, and he became obsessed with translating it and discovering its secrets. He traveled all over on this mission, and at some point ran into a guy who told him that the book was called The Book of Abraham the Jew, which led Flamel to even more sources, and began work finally unraveling the book's knowledge with his wife Purnell helping him. At long last, the couple succeeded in creating the Philosopher's Stone and then the Elixir of Life, which granted both of them immortality. Indeed, alleged sightings of Flamel cropped up numerous times in the years following the book's publication, which is really funny because at that point, no one knew what the dude actually looked like because Nicholas Flamel lived from 1330 to 1418, a solid 200 years before that book was published. Not only that, but this 17th century book is the first instance we have of alchemy being attributed to him at all. So let's go back in time a couple of centuries to the real Nicholas Flamel. He was, in reality, a merchant of manuscripts and a scrivener, which is basically a dude who was literate and could write back when that wasn't really a widespread thing. So his job was to be the guy who took down official documents and letters and made copies. Not the same thing as a scribe. Those guys copied books before the printing press. It's different, okay? Anyway, Flamel ran a few shops with his wife in Paris, and this worked out pretty well because she came with a big inheritance, meaning the two had a lot of money to donate, and donate they did to various churches. So in general, Flamel became a well-known figure because he put his money to good use. One use being that he commissioned a tombstone artist to make his tombstone from his own design. A thing that heavily influences the alchemy legend for reasons I do not understand. So why the hell did some anonymous 17th century writer choose Flamel as the subject of a great alchemy myth? Honestly, no one really knows. Maybe it's because he died so long ago and had the basic lore that would make it fit. He's dead, so he can't really speak for himself anymore. But people ran with it, and he sort of became the mascot of 17th century alchemists. They were like, see, there really was a guy who made the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life, and we can do it too. And then, of course, pop culture got a hold of him, notably as a central figure in Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and then later, of course, in Harry fucking Potter. But Nicholas Flamel was not an alchemist. He was literally just some guy. He's also a fabulous example of 17th to 19th century apocryphal history. Time and time again, writers would take some historical figure, write literal undisclosed fan fiction about them, publish it, and then people in the 19th to 20th centuries were like, oh my god. This story from a book written centuries after this person died, which is also the earliest record we have of this story, must be true. I am going to call this a contemporary source, and I am going to embellish it with my own artistic flair that will confuse the general public for decades to come, maybe even forever. Don't you just love exquisite corpse historical narratives? For those of you who aren't cartoonists, or artists, an exquisite corpse is a type of drawing or a comic that you make in a group where one person starts the image with one panel or a small bit of the drawing, and then you pass it around in a circle and each person continues it bit by bit. So much of history works exactly like this. It's astounding. Yeah, okay, tangent over. I'm so sorry. I had to address the Nicholas Flamel thing because he has become such a massive figure in alchemy and is a really good example of, I guess, the arcanifying of alchemy. Not that it was never arcane at all. It definitely was in many ways, but we really truly have misunderstood alchemy since the 17th century, at least. And the Flamel myth is a perfect example of this. By positing a man who apparently succeeded in creating the two main objects of alchemical tradition, the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life, and insinuating that he's still out there running around and he just wrote this book at large at the genesis of the Enlightenment and the beginning of modern chemistry, obviously the result is that alchemy becomes a mythological, esoteric fantasy, rather than a historical science that completely made logical sense to medieval knowledge of the natural world, which was already completely intertwined with mysticism. Hjalmar Fors writes in the Encyclopedia of Early Modern Philosophy and the Sciences, magical and mystical thought were mainstays, indeed integral parts of early modern culture. Simultaneously, chrysopoeia, the transmutation of more common metals into gold, was, as we've seen, a perfectly rational proposition, given the then current theories of natural philosophy. Hence, the singling out of alchemy as a superstitious, irrational, and impossible enterprise is unfair. It is also, at least for the early modern period, historically incorrect. In many important ways, alchemy was a direct precursor of contemporary chemistry. But even so, alchemy faced a lot of backlash even at the height of its popularity. Giles of Rome, who was a student of Thomas Aquinas, was vehemently anti-alchemy. This may seem odd considering that Thomas Aquinas was seemingly very pro-alchemy, but in truth, a lot of works attributed to him were, shocker, actually written posthumously and claimed he was the author. A trend that happened a lot in the Middle Ages, especially to philosophers like Aristotle. Dudes would write a book and then be like, Thomas Aquinas wrote it, in an attempt at claiming trust and legitimacy. So in reality, Thomas Aquinas was quite critical of alchemy, and his student Giles of Rome, as a result, became a full-fledged alchemy hater. He firmly believed that even if man could artificially produce real gold, it still would not be comparable to natural gold, and you certainly can't sell it. But of course, men can't make gold, so don't worry about it. Giles was not alone. The growing popularity of alchemy made the church extremely concerned about counterfeiting. Oldrado da Ponte wrote in his famous work Concilium 74 that clearly anyone who believes in alchemy is not a Christian because the art of transmutation at the hands of anyone but God is heresy. But despite the backlash, the inherent draw of alchemy remained. After all, who can possibly resist the possibility of human power beyond the bounds of nature? The possibility that, like God, a mere mortal can transform Earth's elements. By the 16th century, the medieval world was fading into the realm of the Renaissance, and with this new era came entirely new ways of thinking. Between the rediscovery of ancient classical texts, the expansion of mass printing, and the emerging age of exploration, colonialism, who said that, as well as new questioning of church doctrines, things were shifting and quickly. Enter Paracelsus, arguably one of the most important characters in this entire story, Philippus Theophrastus Aureolus Bombast von Hohenheim, known popularly as Paracelsus, thank God, was an extremely world-traveled and well-educated German man. And with his education, he openly combated the medical and alchemical establishments, questioning why these immensely important fields are driven by men who don't experiment, who care more about wealth than study. He believed that not all alchemy was bad, but that the purpose of alchemy shouldn't be to create gold. It should be used for medicine. And so was born the Paracelsian world of medicine, which adopted alchemical practices to slowly become today's chemistry. Paracelsus believed that we needed to move away from the more herbal teachings of Galen and Ibn Sina, and instead use chemical solutions, leading to the birth of the pharmaceutical world. And yes, this was also the birth of the bizarro patent and quack medicine industries. Hey, you win some, you lose some. Early chemistry was a definite natural progression from its alchemical roots, and it was heavily grounded in philosophy, like alchemy was. It too drew upon already well-established ways of experimentation. Distillation, combining, burning, new doohickeys and whoozy-whatsits were invented. As the scientific revolution emerged, new discoveries in the realm of anatomy were made. And then came the Age of Reason in the 18th century. And so the world of medieval chemical mysticism and gilded dreams of man-made gold were forgotten, ridiculed, abandoned. Not by everyone, no, there were still some alchemists running around doing their thing, but in large part, alchemy survived in a really predictable form. Apocryphal texts, reprintings, translations, and new sensationalized tales. Of course, the myth of Nicholas Flamel, allegedly at large, was still alive and very popular, but something very permanent had, fittingly, transmutated alchemy. It would never again exist in its original form, that of an often maligned but considerably valid form of science. Instead, it would exist in its dazzling new form, an arcane art that is kept alive in the realm of esoterica and pop culture. Alchemy never went away, it simply changed. And there's no more fitting fate for it than that, I think. Alchemy is particularly interesting to me because it challenges a lot about how we think about the pre-Enlightenment world. It makes us think extra hard about how religion and science intersected and pushes against our preconceived notions of the Middle Ages as a completely anti-intellectual, backwards, dark age of unscientific stagnation. In reality, alchemy exemplifies the rather incredible intersection of medieval philosophy, faith, and hunger for knowledge and science. It wasn't just about gold or silver or elixirs or magic stones. At its core, alchemy was about learning more about how our world works and figuring out what happens when we try to change it. Unlike popular belief, medieval people were very scientific. They questioned everything and they argued. My God, did they argue. With the church, with each other, with God, with themselves. Alchemy, I think, is a perfect symbolic encapsulation of everything we tend not to understand about history. To understand why it existed at all, you need to first try to put yourself in its contemporary context. And so many things work the same way with history. People have always been curious and asked questions. They always had cats bothering them while they're trying to do something important. Maybe they never manufactured real gold from mercury and sulfur, but it sure does glitter nonetheless. Thank you for learning with me about the history of alchemy, and let me know in the comments, have you seen Nicholas Flamel running around? Don't forget to grab a copy of my graphic novel, Liberated, The Radical Art and Life of Claude Cahun, and until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and ask your doctor if the Philosopher's Stone is right for you.